Welcome, everybody. So this is a bit of an out-of-the-box conversation, but we feel like it's going to be a valuable thing to talk about. I guess for me, this started a few years back at this conference where there was a conversation with, for those of you who weren't here, a man named Fred Provenza wrote this book. It's out on the table called Nourishment. And what it leads into is the ability of animals, wild animals and domesticated animals and ourselves in our natural state to varying degrees, ability to interact with real diverse landscapes and diversity in general, and to be able to access information beyond what we have learned from birth. So the example would be for locating nourishment and locating self-medicating phytochemistry in the landscape. It dawned on me in some of the conversations we were having here about some very high-tech equipment to basically measure the same things, and why does our species need an external nervous system, in a sense, to do what all the other animals and indigenous peoples and all of us to varying degrees? So we need to talk into here. Okay. So that's one piece of this that I'll lead in with. And another one is an interesting book that I read. I don't know how many people are familiar with it. It's called Return to the Brain of Eden. It's very fascinating territory. I'll try to summarize very quickly in that it's proposing that our original state that came from tropical forest ecosystems and our diets that were loaded in flavonoids and neurotransmitter precursors and hormone modulators were the period when our brains tripled in size as a primate, and then when we left that environment into savannas because of climate change and moving into grassland environments and eating more grasses and more meat, that there were some imbalances that were occurring that, long story short, moved us toward a more of a left brain dominance kind of a situation that we find ourselves deeply within now, to the point where we don't remember well outside of that. However, all cultures have these stories that have a lot of overlap about a golden age or a falling from grace or a period when we were in really close connection with animals. And then different things happen. So I think that this story is largely talking about the breach between the left and the right brain, and the ability of the left brain to control and suppress the aspects of the right brain that have high levels of capacity for recognizing patterns beyond what the left brain can keep track of, complexity-wise. I will say that one of the strongest pieces in here that have influenced me was that in the modern era, there have been a whole series of cases of people with bullet wounds and strokes and baseball bats and car accidents that had their left frontal lobe removed or knocked out temporarily or permanently. And in that group of people, there have been an emergence of pretty phenomenal autistic savant capacities in music, art, language, and math. And so how do you explain that those abilities arising spontaneously with the absence of the control system in place is what it looks to me. So there's another thing that I think that goes back quite a long time, and it seems like there's a pattern of different cultural responses to this, that wise people saw this happening in each of the different cultures. And in the Eastern traditions, there was been a strong tendency toward meditation and yoga and things like that. In the Western traditions, there was some on both sides of the other, but in general, there was a lot of shamanic use of entheogenic plants.
Still, you to speak a little,
okay,
a
sorry.
Closer if possible.
So the entheogens or psychoactive plants have this ability to remove that firewall pretty rapidly, maybe in a kind of a chaotic way, and needs a lot of guidance and control. For example, Michael Pollan's talking about this now. It's become popular after, a lot of us have known this for a very long time. But he's talking about how as little as one dose of psilocybin can allow a person to break addictions. And I think a lot of the patterns we're trying to move away from with monocultures and chemicals and control and hierarchy and male dominance and so forth, these are all things you can expect when you have an unbalanced left brain. And so what we're not talking about getting rid of or demonizing the left brain, we want to balance it. And so moving into this more democratic relationship between our lobes of our brain. And so there's those pieces. On that same point, Dennis McKenna, some of you may know, he's done some interesting work with shamans in the Amazon. One example I found fascinating was the going out with the shaman into the rainforest and collecting species used for ayahuasca, which is a psychoactive plant blend, and he would go out and listen to them, name it, put a number on it, and hear that this one is moderate, this one is strong, this one is weak, and then he numbered them all, took them back to the mass spectrometer and tested them for the compounds of dimethyltryptamines and harmalines, and found that it was 100% right on the money, that this shaman had nailed it. And he's like, wow, this is strange, because all of these are, science today only recognizes, Banisteriopsis caapi as the species, and then here are these shamans that have a system of taxonomy that goes way beyond that. And when they asked the shamans, how do you know the difference? What they told them was that they ingest these compounds, and then the different plants sing to them in different tones. And so this points to a whole different kind of access to information than I think generally science looks at. But I think a lot of this has to do with our comfort with diversity and the tendency to reduce diversity more recently, particularly. Why do people feel more comfortable with a mowed lawn or a monoculture of row crops that they can control, and what is this need for control, and why do we have to reduce diversity, because this has become an existential issue now. Diversity is far too important to suppress. And I've seen in quite a few, I've been doing some experiential learning curriculums with taking people out into tropical forests and into the natural world and experientially opening this process up. And there's a nutritional component which ties into this conference directly. And with higher levels of nutrition, it begins to empower right brain and allow this process to kind of open up a bit. So there's another piece about just connection in general, which is this continuum between the gut-brain axis through the vagus nerve and the communication, say, from the, certainly from the gut, but also the heart, because I think a lot of what we're talking about in this whole process is very much about our heart and connection and so forth. So there's been a lot of emerging evidence of the connectivity between the microbiome and our brain and our emotional states, anxieties, and other mental imbalances emanating from the gut. And there was one recent study I looked at where they had been looking at autistic mice, and introducing one gut microbe was able to totally change the social interaction of these mice. Again, pointing to some power in the diversity in our gut. So that continues out, because the diversity in our gut is coming through, ideally through our food, to local soils. When we walk in the forest, we're breathing in DNA that's being incorporated into our microbiome, and so on. So what I'd like to just open this conversation, let my friends respond a little bit in their understanding of this, but ideally come up with some tools that we can use to begin to counterbalance some of these forces, because we're all being acted on very strongly by a number of forces, both conditioning by the culture and the economy and social systems, but also by toxins in the environment. Endocrine disruption has been proven to disrupt the ability to adapt in a healthy organism, animals and people, to adapt to a change in the environment, to create huge amounts of stress where a healthy animal would just quickly adapt. For example, glyphosate pathway through the vagus nerve and through intercellular communication is also having issues or showing serious blockage to our healthy, connected, communicating state. So a lot of this also has a lot to do with our sense of self. It's critical that we understand that we are interdependent and connected to a superorganism of sorts, and we operate from that place as opposed to an isolated. It's not just our cells that are being isolated, it's our whole perception of who we are. And when we begin to act as a superorganism in our representation of our behavior and our language of speaking for the other species that aren't being represented, we enter into a whole other relationship, and I think that's where we really need to go. I will open it up to some comments, whoever would like to step in. I'm Mark Cohen, by the way, and I'll let everybody introduce themselves.
Hi, you all. My name is Guido Masé. I'm an herbalist who lives in Vermont. And as an herbalist, I think there's two main pieces to my work. One is I engage in herbal therapy in a clinical setting. But the other is that herbalism is my personal practice too. And what I mean by that is that I go out to the woods and I talk to trees, and I go out to my garden and I have these spiritual experiences with the plants in my garden. And I noticed, I think early on, I've been gardening medicinal plants since '96 when I moved to Vermont. I noticed early on that my garden did a whole lot better if I just I described it as let the plants in the garden dictate where and how I was going to work to support that garden ecology, as opposed to me dictating where the plants were going to be and how they were going to grow. I started to notice, for example, that St. John's wort didn't like being planted where I put it, but would show up in another place and thrive and look great. And so pretty quickly after a couple growing seasons of seeing this with these perennial herbs, I just said, hey, I'm here to just support you with nutrition and water as necessary, hopefully not too much. It works out great because I'm a lazy gardener. But in the end, the thing that really was brought home to me is that I am more of a garden steward and an organ in this garden ecology or in this forest ecology where I'm having these connected experiences with plants. And so it got me to thinking about how perhaps when I'm working in the garden, my consciousness is not fully directed by me. It's partly directed by the garden. And that just felt incredible to me because it made me feel like my life was being directed by forces that were bigger than my own and with whom I could have a relational understanding as opposed to this top-down divinity to lowly human understanding that I'd been brought up with in the Catholic Church in Italy. So that's one part. It's this sort of idea of transpersonal, greater consciousnesses in which I'm embedded when I work in the garden or when I wild harvest in the forest. And y'all know if you're walking in a place and the air changes and the plants change and you're like, something is different here, maybe I should pay attention. It's like you're walking into a different being. And there you find different plants, and sometimes these strange thoughts come into my head that's like, you've got to take this kind of deer trail that you see on the right that you've never gone down, and who knows what you might find there. And lo and behold, on a south-facing rock with this big pile of deep forest humus, you find ginseng. Mm-hmm. And I don't harvest it, I sit there and I just say, ginseng, tell me your stories. I do grow some ginseng, but I refuse to wild harvest it because of its amazing presence in the woods, and I really feel like it. Anyway, I won't get into it too much. The second side is that I'm a therapeutic person, which means I work with people one-on-one in clinic, and we're talking about mental health imbalances, for example. I have this protocol when working with people who come to me and are talking about anxiety, depression, and mood disruption that involves really a few different stages. The first stage is gut microbiome, believe it or not, and using herbs that help sort of flush out potential dysbiotic species and set the stage for the reintroduction of healthy gut flora through ferment and prebiotic starches, for example, which come from medicinal plants like burdock and from fermented foods. All of that lays this amazing foundation for mental health, and we understand the mechanisms now, everything from leaky gut to disruption of the gut serotonergic system, for instance. Then you use herbs that catalyze balance in terms of neurotransmitter activity. We've got a lot of herbs that really mimic and echo the same neurotransmitters that we produce as human animals. The ecology produces them through plants as well, things like dopamine from Mucuna pruriens, or St. John's wort, which modulates some of the serotonergic axes, or some of our adaptogen herbs like rhodiola that modulate like norepinephrine axes and the stress hormones, for instance. And then sometimes we'll use capstone experiences using agents like psilocybin, which I use in my practice. Don't tell anyone about that. Or salvinorin A from this incredible shamanic plant, that's all right, called Salvia divinorum, which has been used to communicate with the spirits of nature since forever. And so this brought into my thinking the idea that our consciousness and our thoughts and our spirits are also connected to what's going on down here and what's going on in our internal environment, as much as they're connected to what's going on in our external environment and how we commune with that. And that leads me to believe that, honestly, what we think of as our personal consciousness really doesn't have discrete or well-defined edges, which is both really scary because what the heck am I if I don't have an edge? But also really empowering because I'm simply a nexus in the movement of consciousness, energy, and chemistry that's flowing throughout the natural world. And when that realization comes to your mind, I don't know. It feels really liberating to me. So that's the perspective I bring. Herbal medicine can be used for therapy, and it relies on understanding the human being as a superorganism with a lot of other organisms living inside it, but also as a part of a greater superorganism, as Mark was alluding to. And when those shifts start to happen, I've noticed in my clients and in myself, it gets a lot harder to talk about deforestation with a glib attitude. It gets a lot harder to talk about industrial pollution with a glib attitude. And you begin to reframe your thinking around regenerative ideas, which are the same ideas that we see in herbal medicine therapy. When regenerative growers and farmers are talking about techniques for soil management and crop management, those are the exact same ideas that I talk about when I'm talking about regenerative therapeutics in the context of human health and disease. So, you know, it's so encouraging for me to see that on the macro level in farms and gardens, folks are talking about the same things we're talking about on the human level when we talk about herbal therapeutics. So that's a little bit about sort of the perspective I bring to this and why I resonate with what Mark is talking about and what I heard Reginaldo talk about yesterday when he was detailing his incredible poultry system.
Hello, I'm Reginaldo, and I speak for the chickens. This is fun. Listen, I'm not gonna do too much of that science and all of the stuff that we normally geek about. I'm going to actually. So here's the thing. I went to a culture school in Guatemala, and then studied business management and communications at Augsburg University in Minnesota. And in between all of that, I completed like 3 masters, which I never went for the graduation thing for. And all of that was in search of a more holistic understanding, not only of who I am as a bunch of energy floating around, but also as an individual that can have a positive or a negative impact around everywhere I go. All of us will do that no matter what. So having been raised mostly with folks with a very deep indigenous understanding of the world was really critical in finding that pathway. Now, here's what I mean. We tend to think of indigenous and natives as one and the same. There is no such thing. Not in my world anyway, and I'll let you decide for yourself. But the way I see it is, and the way I was brought up is, technically we are all, every single person on earth is indigenous. Is indigenous to the earth, period. Unless you didn't come from this earth, then I will, excuse you from that classification. Now, some of us are native to certain parts of the world, like North America, like Latin America, like South America, and so on. But that's a different thing. And that's where the whole thing about whether you live in the rainforest like I did or in the desert, and that defines a lot of how we see the world. And because of our origins and our geoevolutionary process, we are all connected at very deep levels no matter what. And that connectedness doesn't materialize until we start understanding these very things that we're talking about. And one thing we have to understand right up front, Guido, you related to that. The way I was explained it when I was a kid was, and this is based literally later, 15, 20 years later, I learned about it, from the laws of thermodynamics that Einstein exposed us to. The laws of, the first law that deals with the conservation of energy. You can't produce it, you can't destroy it, you can only transform it. And the second one is the law of entropy, where everything tends to dissipate. In this coffee, if I leave it here long enough, this will empty out because it tends to dissipate. Now, we are a very highly organized system of energy. But that energy that you carry around, that energy has been through dinosaurs, trees, bugs, butterflies, birds. It has been in the ocean, in the air, everywhere for millions of years. You just happen to be borrowing it right now so you can be here. And just the same as you started borrowing it when you were born, you will have to give it away when you go away. And it will become something else. Now, understanding that is what makes us indigenous, not being native to a specific space. Now, to the extent that we don't understand that, it's very difficult to be part of a world where we can see each other as just part of a universal expression of an evolutionary process which nature has designed and perfected so that we can be right here, right now. To me, with that foundation, it's very easy to do regenerative engineering. It's very easy to understand the relationship within the gut, the heart, the brain, all of that. It's just a big canvas. It's a piece of art. And then we come here with this science and technology, which I was very well trained on, and row crops and inputs and a piece of land and then outputs on the other side, and we allow that to take over. Now, why did we go in that direction? Mark and I were just discussing these points before we came in here, and it hit me that all the way from Angus King and before him, communities, in order to control the bandits, so to speak, the ones with the control freaks in their communities, they exiled them because there were no jails or any of that. And what do you do if out of this group, we take the 5 troublemakers and then we put them away and send them out into the forest? Well, they band together, and then the other village does the same. They band together, and then you end up creating this very, sophisticated and very powerful little group, which, by the way, all you need is a small group like that to take over a whole society. And hence, we started colonizing the rest and the rest and the rest until Christopher Columbus ended up around here. Now, there's a big difference between that mentality, that left frontal lobe mentality of control and order and all of that, so that you can actually manipulate everything, which is what we use when we call ourselves farmers. We don't see ourselves as energy managers of edible energy, which we then manage through a process, or at least oversee, or like Guido say, observe and try to become part of, so that on the other end we can have edible energy in the form of carrots and eggs and chickens and all of that. I don't believe farmers think of themselves like that. I think most of us think of ourselves as chicken producers or carrot producers or herb producers, but we are not. None of us produces a thing. It all produces itself. And if we can just focus on stewarding that energy from this entropic form to a highly organized form, and we commune with that historical and that amazing system, we actually do much better than otherwise. And that requires that we intellectually understand why diversity is important, back to restoring those neurological pathways. But why is to the point of what's different between the colonizers that came to the United States versus the native people who were here already? It's not like the native people were not colonizing each other either. They were already doing that. The Mayans were doing that. The natives here were doing that too. Christopher Columbus wasn't the colonizer. He was just one that was out of balance in a relationship between the holistic brain and the order-based part of the brain. So what did we have in the native communities that these other folks didn't have? We had a detox system. And what Guido was talking about and what Mark was talking about was that we actually had this process by which, as we became more, engaged in dominating each other, we also had a continuous going back to reconnect with that world that I was talking about at the beginning. And so we were able to balance this thing and just stay in control of the two of them. These folks who came, they no longer had control. They were literally mentally ill. And that mental illness is what landed us where we are today. And to be able to cure ourselves from that, we have to detox. And there is no better detox than everything that nature created. Remember, we walk around with a magnetic field around us. That's what we produce. In fact, in these days, you can shock somebody because we produce electromagnetic, fields and static electricity and all of that, energy and all of that. And that creates a little protective system around us. If you get too close to somebody with a strong personality, you can feel it. Now, you have to get in touch with that ability that we have, which is called innate intelligence, to be able to know those things. We happen to be raised in a space where we were taught how to know that. We always knew where north was. We always knew when it was going to rain. Maybe not as far as what you can do with satellite now, because you can see the clouds, but we knew the way your body reacts to the changes in barometric pressure is very specific, but you won't know that unless you're paying attention. And so on. That connectedness was a way to detox. The trees, they don't produce electromagnetic fields. They produce chemical fields. A forest can be floating and at any given time between 400 and 600 chemicals. We evolved over, absorbing those chemicals and interacting with them and letting them cure us. And that was part of the mental stability. That's part of connecting back to that energy cycles in life. When we do those things, everything makes sense. And we start to see each other very differently when we actually understand who we are in this very long process of energy transformation. So let's be thankful for the fact that we have this energy today, that we can actually have a conversation about it. And let's go back and start thinking about how we re-indigenize ourselves so we can actually become part of the system instead of believing somehow in this illusion that we can control it. It is simply not possible.
Okay, so I guess I'd like to return momentarily back to kind of the experiential aspect of this. And something happened for me when, as a dowser, I began getting into dowsing originally for water and then for other energetic fields in the landscape, much like healers look at the nervous system pathways and pressure points and such in the body. But I won't go into that too much. What I wanted to say about it was that when, in my opinion, all intelligent organisms come to terms with inevitably with the fact that they are simultaneously finite and infinite. And when the part of our being that's finite has needs, particularly when they're really strong needs, when you're in trouble, when you're existentially challenged, there's a communication that's forced. But in the dowsing process, it's not, when I say dowsing, I mean all cultures through time that had systems of divination, of accessing information fields that were far beyond what they had learned from birth, tapping into racial memory and other informational fields. And when that question gets put from the finite to the infinite, and you get a strong either muscular response or clear communication back, there's a inevitable dissolution of a previous perception of finiteness but separation, I guess I would say. And from that separated space, I think is emerging the fears that are driving and then the fears are being derived from being culturally taught and being chemically affected and all sorts of other types of abuse that turns eventually back into an abusing response. Abused people turn into abusers very often. And so in order to break that cycle, there's this fusion experience, and Guido was alluding to it, I think, for those of us who have had these intuitive experiences in the forest when we're either looking for mushrooms or ginseng or something, and we get taken down these side pathways and processes open up. That is really resonating with the longest period of human existence. And as hunter-gatherers, it was easily 90+% of our history, and yet we're really being dominated by thought in this last 10,000 years as agricultural species and so forth. And so we're waking up abilities that are really critical. We have this massive neurological system that's incredibly complex, that we have receptors and neurons and communication molecules that are sending messages. The question is, are we reading from the whole dashboard, or are we cutting lines because we don't like the news, and so we cut the dashboard lights out to what we want to deal with. And so how do we wake that back up is part of the question. But I also had been looking at, in this process of developing a sense of place and looking at compatibility with biodiversity, and comfort levels and fears, and where do the fears really arise from. A lot of it came down to how we define ourselves. Are we, how finite and separate are we? So I began looking at a Buddhist concept of small mind and big mind, and the process of moving from small mind to big mind, and kind of going from egocentric to anthropocentric to biocentric. And so in an egocentric state, we would be really looking for our own benefit. And then we start moving into thinking that maybe we care about all people, and that we should save rainforests because there's medicine there for us, as opposed to inherent sacramental nature of this larger superorganism. And I started to connect tendencies at these different levels. And so from the egocentric, there's a feeling of separation. At the biocentric, there's an interdependent relationship to wholeness and diversity. And then a logical outcome of separation is fear, and then hoarding and greed. At the biocentric end, and it's really more of a sense of wonder and respect and gratitude and generosity. You find yourself moving from linear to cyclical thinking, short-term to long-term thinking, the idea of when you're considering an effect on the world 7 generations out compared to the fiscal year profits. These are fundamental thought processes that are molding our decisions. Mechanistic and reductionistic to organic, alive, holistic relationships. In religion, it tends to be external gods that are tending to be male at the separated end, and divinity within now at the more integrated biocentric end. And heaven is something that happens after death. On that piece, the centralized to decentralized, competitive to cooperative emphasis. You get my point. But this first category seems to define perfectly generally the world's governments at this time, with a few exceptions in Bhutan and places like that.
Should we open it up?
Yeah. So I guess we'll open it up to questions, and we'll deal with the rest of it from there. But we just wanted to get this out in the air. It's not a typical category, but maybe down the line the conference can integrate a category to speak to some of this territory, because it seems to be really underlying. Yes?
Yeah, I've been waiting for a panel like this for 3 years. Because one of the things I think, and perhaps it's also coming from an herbalist perspective, I'm not a public herbalist, I'm private, I do that with family, and I come from the tradition of herbalism in the Balkans. And so for me, I really appreciated this, a few things. One is that relationship to being indigenous to the earth and native to a space, and finding an inroad for all of us to relate to that. But then also, when it comes to the farming, and when people are talking about farming, I really am only now starting to see a space where people are talking about leaving room for the native intelligence of the native plants to come through, because without that, we will lose those medicines, and we'll lose all of that relationship. So I just really want to comment and thank you that I've been waiting for someone to say that.
Sure.
You mentioned detoxing. What is that? Like, what do you do to detox?
And can I remind we'd like you to repeat
Yeah.
the question
Yeah.
so it gets into the recording.
Sure. Yeah, the first was a comment, so I won't repeat that, but the question about what did, I believe, Reginaldo refer to as detoxing?
Yeah, maybe Guido and I, if you don't mind, could answer that together, because I think we just got a lot more of the experience on the specific herbs, for example, that can be used to flush out, to move toxins out of your body. Now, that is one kind of detoxification. What I was talking about is decolonization of the mind. So detoxifying and getting rid of the virus of greed and colonized thinking. To do that, we go back to understanding who we are. Literally, we are just, again, a lot of energy, highly organized, so that we can do what we're doing right now, which will eventually disorganize again and reorganize in another form. So to detoxify what native communities in this hemisphere, which is what I know more, but it's also the same around the world, those folks who were continuing to practice indigenous understanding of the earth and their role within it would go back to either meditation. In our case, the forest walks are about the best detox you could ever do for mental, but also physical. Well, actually both, they're the same anyway. So these chemicals in the forest, having grown up in the war, there was nothing more like mind-blowing and amazing. What it would do to take your shoes off and barefoot stand in a piece of ground that has not been treated by anybody. And the immediate, it is almost like if you are afraid right now of something, and all you do is you take a deep breath through your nose and exhale through your mouth, and instantly the brain and the body gets a message, it's okay. And all of those chemicals that we produce to defend and to fight and all of that go away. Not all of them, but it goes away to a certain extent. And then if you continue, you meditate a little bit, all of that gets the brain back to a level where you can actually think again with the more creative part. You are not in the flight, fight kind of mode. And in the forest, what we did was really allow the energy in the space to balance out our imbalance that came from being under attack very frequently. And so that was one way we kept detoxifying. But remember, detox isn't something that you do and is done. That's something we have to do continuously. We go out there and all of these chemicals, you're going to absorb them through your palm of your hands, your feet, through your breathing, all of that. They're going to come back in you. And if we don't have those exceptional biopathways that some people have that can actually eliminate things, which I'm so envious of. If we're not blessed with that kind of biopathway, the rest of us has to continuously go back and detoxify. And to us, the best way, because we were being trained and there were agronomists coming in with chemicals when I was still a kid and all of that. And I remembered one detoxification experience that we had in relationship to this mentality that you can control the weeds and so on and so forth. It was the first time we were using this chemical called gramoxone. I don't know how many of you have been exposed to it. It's an old chemical. It was the first one that made it into our region. Our problem with weeds in the rainforest was primarily grasses. And this gramoxone could kill all of them. And so we applied it. I wrote this in my book. It's called In the Shadow of Green Man. And I wrote, that's the spiritual grounding to the next publication I'm writing, which is all the techniques and all of that for the regenerative poultry system that I presented on yesterday. But that story was really powerful because we did what everybody was doing. We followed the instructions. We killed all the weeds. And remember, working with those weeds is very hard physically and all of that. So obviously we wanted a better solution, right? The thing is, when we finished that, we came back with some of the elders and with my dad in charge, and we observed this space. And we had a meditation about it. And what my dad said to the rest of the group was that he couldn't do this. He couldn't repeat this. And the reason was, if something can be so violent that even the worst weeds couldn't survive it, what would it do to us? It was like I never had to think of whether I was going or not going to use chemicals. I was maybe 9 years old, and I made my decision then. That is detoxification of the mind, decolonization of the mind, and we have to do that every single day these days because we are surrounded by it. Everything from the way these chairs were laid out to the way we even approach this conversation is fully colonized.
My job.
Maybe I'll add just a little bit on the question of what is this concept of detox, and I'll start by saying I push back still on the idea of detox because there's this weird implication that we're dirty, which I don't believe. And again, as a recovering Catholic, this idea that we're born sinful is not one that I really resonate with, though there are other pieces that I do resonate with. So for me, like Reginaldo was saying, detox is complex and multi-layered, and it can happen at many different levels. So to give you some examples, I need to go through a personal detox at least a couple times a year that involves going out to the ridgelines of the Green Mountains and sitting out there for 3 or 4 days with a tent and some water, and that's it. And that's pretty incredible. It gives me creative fodder to last 6 months when I do that. And it's because the day-to-day stuff that I have to deal with, which is the reality of our modern life, goes away after about 24 to 36 hours of being out in the forest. Your brain rhythms start to shift, partly because we're living in this environment that's eluding all of this chemistry, the woods, that evolutionarily has meaning for us. And so plugging back into that is sort of a major first detox step for me that I need to go through personally. The idea of sort of having a daily detox as well, where you put down all the devices, and maybe you turn off some lights, and maybe you just spend a little time out in the garden sitting and having a meditative practice or something like that, also can be really effective. But for many people, that's really tough to do. Part of the reason is because we are so bombarded with everything from the information superhighway to our devices, and they're pinging us every single day, and the TVs and the radio and the cars going at 100 miles an hour, etc. So what I found as an herbalist is that sometimes you can intervene with plants that have biochemical detoxification effects, and we define that very specifically in herbal medicine as things that improve liver function, our main detoxification and metabolic organ, generally improve the secretion of bile, help people poop better and perspire better so that the system flows, right? So that any material that needs to be eliminated can be eliminated. And what I found is that when we use herbs that affect biochemical detoxification pathways, it has this impact on the mind too, and on our ability to do things like back off and engage in observation and stop like running blindly forward in the service of profit and progress, which is a difficult thing to say. It's like, I'm just going to take a moment and I'm going to have a full night's sleep because I might actually perform better tomorrow if I do that, as opposed to spending 4 hours trying to finish this project tonight. So to bring it back and talk about how detoxification works at multiple different levels, and go back to this idea of violent chemistry that Reginaldo was talking about, which we somehow feel comfortable using. No one is stopping, like Reginaldo's father, and saying, like, wait a second, how is this stuff affecting the ecology in which we live, and therefore us in the end? No one is stopping to think about that because we're so driven by these ideas. You might call them left brain if you want to, or you could just call them sort of modern techno-corporate capitalism, which has been the dominant paradigm for a little while. And so I'll just tell a story that I tell all the time, so apologies to those who've heard this before. I had a client who was coming to talk to me about the effects of eating the food that the techno-capitalist corporate market gives us, and how it generated symptoms for him, like heartburn or constipation or difficulty with digestion. And he didn't have a lot of experience with herbal medicine. The last thing I wanted to do was, as a tangent, when the corporate, capitalist, profit-driven herbal world, which exists, we call it the dietary supplement industry, gets a hold of herbal medicine and this idea of detox, what does it do? It makes the twice-a-year colon cleanse product to clean your dirty colon so that you can be detoxed and less inflamed. It's like, it's so crazy to see how these indigenous concepts of relating to the world get co-opted by the machine in this totally non-mindful way. But anyway, that's a tangent. The point is that I said, rather than doing those sorts of things, let me introduce you to this dandelion root extract, and take that a couple times a day before your meals and see what it does for your symptoms. And we know about dandelion that it improves sort of hepatobiliary action, improves bile secretion, helps regulate bowel function. It's one of our classic simple bitters and has been used in detox support by herbalists forever. So he tries this for a little while. A couple weeks later he comes back for our follow-up and he says, I really like the dandelion root tincture. It's helped me. I'm having a lot less heartburn and my digestion generally feels a lot better. And you might say he detoxed his digestion a little bit. But the thing that I think is much more profound is that he said to me, is that the same dandelion that's in my yard? And can I use this too? I'm like, absolutely you can. He's like, is it the same stuff that I spray Roundup on? And I said, yes, don't use those. Stop spraying the Roundup. And he's like, I think I will. So that implies to me that you can use biochemical detoxification that might rebalance digestive function, help us eliminate some material that the liver might not be processing really well. And lo and behold, this has this weird effect on the brain because psyche and soma are not connected. And not only that, but then the different choices that human makes, who is connected relationally to an indigenous plant. Plants are indigenous, and they relate to the world that way. Then all of a sudden can have these ecological impacts. And imagine if everyone who lives in a suburban lawn who sprays Roundup on their dandelions had that same experience that guy had. We would have cultural detox. So it happens at like multiple different levels, though there are some very specific biochemical pathways that can be employed to catalyze that. And that's what a lot of these quote-unquote detox herbs do if they're applied properly and gently and with respect, as opposed to commodified and used twice a year. I often tell my clients, if you wanted to lose weight, would you just sit on the couch all year long, except for once a year, you'd run 20 miles a day, every single day, and not eat? No one would try to lose weight that way. But that's how we think of detox in the modern dietary supplement world. It's not, like Reginaldo said, an experience that you have and then you're enlightened. It's a daily habit that retrains your mind to not look at the world in this reductionist way, which science has sometimes forced us to do because it's trying to control variables and get an understanding of what's happening in the world. And I respect that and I get it. But the world can't be controlled. It just can't. It has to be lived. And getting people back into that place is really what I think detox is about.
I had the privilege of attending Reginaldo's course of session yesterday, where he talked about his poultry and the method of farming, and I would suggest going online and getting the recording of that and listening to it. To me it it was a wonderful manifestation of putting this type of at one with the universe practice into farming. It was an amazing example. I would like to hear a little bit about how that relates, how you can, how that works with more of a produce focus, more vegetative focus. I really got the mix of the chickens and the plants and how it became clear which plants do better in certain areas with the focus on the poultry farming. What I wanted to know is if there were just sort of any ways to get a better sense of how to do that if you're dealing simply with vegetative growth. Because it was just an amazing example of how to apply this practice.
Since this is not the poultry session, and in respect of that topic, I will write a note and I can communicate with you on that. But it is part of this detox we're talking about. It's part of that daily meditation. We didn't arrive at that system just because I am an engineer. That part was actually useful, just like Guido just said. We still need to balance, and Mark also mentioned about that balance. All I did was balance, Western, straight line thinking with the four-dimensional nature of farming. And as a result, we can engineer absolutely awesome systems. We don't have to compromise on, the comforts of top quality chicken and eggs. We just got to get to it through the right pathway. That's all I'm going to say, because we are still talking about brain waves here. So let it.
The brainwaves really extend.
Okay.
Before the next question, let me just throw one thing on brainwaves, and that the toxins aren't always coming from the outside. And actually, Reginaldo was speaking to that, this colonialism in our own head. But there's another level to this of the emotional states that we hold in our body is changing the chemistry in real time in our blood. There's a woman named Candace Pert wrote a book on called Molecules of Emotion. And Bruce Lipton wrote a book called Biology of Belief, if you want to dive into this territory a little bit. But a lot of this is, toxins that we produce, in the moment, depending on how we hold the awareness in our mind. So you're talking about meditation. There's a wide range of states that we can talk about in that. But we are actually producing, in a sense, at the end of the day, we're either producing, stress molecules and cortisols and things like that from anger and hatred and those kinds of emotions, or in a state of love we'd be producing a whole different set of compounds. And so anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in there as part of a larger conversation about detox in how we think.
That whole thing's really well documented, Mark, in terms of experiencing love and having biochemical shifts happen in the body, and also the rhythms of our brain waves, our respiratory, tidal rhythm, and our heart rhythm all entrain and sync up. And then because the heart is an electromagnetic oscillator, and if we're in that state and we relate to someone else, boy, those two people begin to sync up. And you can do that with plants because plants resonate electromagnetically via the photosystem. I don't know about chickens, but I bet that they do as well.
They are 98 degrees Fahrenheit temperature, and if you got that temperature, you will produce a magnetic field. So they will.
So yes, I don't know who was first, but
Behind now, but.
what?
You
pick.
move to the front. Yes.
So I want to thank all of you for this conversation. It's so needed. It's the complement to all of the techie stuff going.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the biodynamic way. It's the Rudolf Steiner way. And it's the indigenous way. And I love this narrative around decolonizing our minds, re-indigenizing. And what you're talking about is forest bathing. It's using psychoactive drugs, not just not drugs, but the plants, not just to dissolve the edges, but to navigate the edges, because that's the most fertile place. When we we have one foot firmly in our groundedness, and we extend our boundaries and feel the connection, the communication. And I wanted to ask you, Reginaldo, you were saying something about, I'm trained in energy medicine. And when you say we're electromagnetic, I got that. But then you said something about trees emitting chemicals. And I was like, wait a minute. And you might have something to say about this too. It's like, what's he talking about? Because my understanding is, there's more of a synchronicity of energetic components between plants and trees and ourselves. And maybe I shouldn't, maybe plants and trees are their own entities. In any case, trees are some big entities, I wanted you to speak on that, and I've just been, next time maybe we can have a circle. Next time maybe we can go outside. Next time maybe we can just rest to go outside and be in a circle, and you bring some kind of ceremonial center, anchor, and we complement what's going on out there with that, because that's the experiment, the experiential piece that's missing. I just said to the Western Price leader, we need more herbalists. We need to cross-pollinate herbal conferences with these type of conferences, get more women in here, get more indigenous people in here, and start talking about communicating and merging with deep intelligence. Because if we just keep, if it's just a matter of inputs, then we're just like the functional doctors who are using the nutraceuticals from the compound pharmacies and have these elaborate protocols to fix something. You know what I'm saying? But anyway, I want to hear about the chemical.
All right, so the ceremonial, I'll love to do it. The only thing I'm going to have to prepare way ahead because I got to ship the components. You can't bring them on a plane. Or I have to drive. Yeah.
You'll never miss a conference that you have.
Yeah.
But you are in Massachusetts, though.
Yeah. About tree as entities. So let's just, for a second, remember that in this context, there is no individual entities on Earth. The Earth is one entity made out of an amazing array of geoevolutionary arrangements of energy that create different patterns of organizing that energy. Some of it are carrots, some of it are worms, some of it is us. None of us are unique, all of us are unique in a certain way of print and stuff, but at the end of the day, we are all exchanging energy in a continuous and in unstoppable ways. So the trees are doing the same thing with each other and with us. That's the disconnection that sometimes allows us, most of the time, that disconnection is what allows us to just cut a tree down with no feelings. I had to cut a black walnut recently, and I hadn't experienced such a sense of sadness and feelings like what you were describing. Because we are also farmers, and so we sometimes have to shoot a possum because it's going to eat all your freaking chickens. So, that kind of thing. And I always have this whole process by which I do that so I can be at peace with everything. Cutting this walnut was very hard. And I couldn't understand why. I have cut a lot of trees, but this walnut was different. I had an experience before because somebody came about 10 years ago when I was developing the poultry system. We call it tree range because we raised the poultry under multiple canopies of trees, just the way they evolved over evolutionary time. And there was this farmer who had a walnut grove, and he asked me, my dad says I should just cut all the walnuts because they decimate everything under them. And I went back and I thought, well, in my training, in my upbringing, we don't just do things like that. We try to understand the world from the perspective of either the chicken, the possum, the hawk, or in this case, the walnut tree. So I went back and studied a little bit more about these chemicals that plants emit. And I realized that, and I learned just by by just inferences and by just logical things that we already have, by using and accessing the innate intelligence, not books, not data, none of that. Our innate intelligence, the intelligence we're born with, is actually way more powerful than that. This is what Mark was talking about before, and it's so real. So I went back to all that experience in the rainforest. Before I went to ag school, I learned a lot of this relationship with the trees and the land and the microbes, and it was very hard to go through that training. I still had to pass because the only way to school was through a scholarship, so I still had to graduate. But it was very painful because I couldn't agree with most of what we were being taught. So same thing, we're looking at this place, and I'm trying to figure out why is the walnut not allowing things to grow under? And so I said, we're not going to touch them. We're going to do a 2-year experiment. And we're going to see whether the walnut can relax and whether the walnut can stop fighting. It's obviously fighting something. What is it fighting? We didn't know that. Now, can we look at the world from the perspective of the walnut? And we started doing that. And I said, well, what is the first thing that we all have to have every day to be able to keep going? Water, food, nutrients. What balances our brain waves and all of that? Good quality nutrition. There's nothing better than that. Mostly because the brain and everything is evolved because of the gut, because of what we have eaten over millions of years. And so I said, well, let's put the chickens under, leave them alone, and let's give the chicken a good quality nutrition. And in those chickens, we included a lot of herbs and nutraceuticals and all kinds of other things. I developed a specific diet for those chickens so that we could give those trees in a biologically available way everything they needed. Okay, I could take you there right now. We haven't touched the trees yet. And everything is thriving under them. Everything. We are growing beautiful forages under in Northfield, Minnesota. The elderberries and the hazelnuts that we put in the understory, they were never developed there. Even the sumac didn't pass the edge. Everything is growing now, and we haven't touched the trees. And that connection is what made me feel this thing about this last tree. That's what I'm going to tell you. This is a real story. I'm not making a single thing up. I can show you the pictures because I've been taking pictures because we were deliberate and conscious about learning from this space. That is what we need to detoxify, to become more indigenous. That's how you re-indigenize, and that is how we become the best farmers that the world actually.
I still don't understand the chemical part though. Like you're saying, the trees emit chemicals and humans emit electromagnetic fields.
Well, the trees also use electromagnetism. The thing is that we actually create a magnetic field. The trees actually create a chemical field. The temperature is actually, they don't produce heat. We produce heat. And heat is critical in order to produce electromagnetic fields. And so we create defenses. What I was saying is that we have a shield around ourselves because of that. And when we have many other biological shields that separate us and that keeps us from getting sick of every breath we take. So the trees create the same kind of protection. But they do it through chemicals, and they communicate through that. They interlock roots sometimes to communicate with each other, and they use the mycosphere as the foundation, as their underground internet. This is well known. We knew this growing up. It's just that now it's being documented, and now people are starting to express this, like Mark was saying before. But the bottom line is that is done so that they can, as organisms, thrive. All of us need to grow, reproduce, protect, and eventually we die. And they are protecting themselves. So the walnut was simply scared of not having enough to perpetuate its own species. And that is why it was producing all these chemicals to get rid of anything that could compete with it. Once we eliminated the scarcity mentality that the walnut was operating under, which is the same thing we do, that's why we fight with each other, compete with each other, trample over each other, and all of that, push others down because we have this scarcity mentality. That was going on with the tree in a very different universe. The tree may not think like us, but it was reacting to the same incentive. Once we removed the threat, it relaxed, and everything is growing. That's what I'm saying.
So this is a very powerful point, so we'll hover here for just a moment. I've been thinking about this too, and so the plant and the soil have a bidirectional flow, and Christine Jones was here a year or two ago, and we were talking about the liquid carbon pathway, and when the plant is getting its needs met, it is able to share much more of the photosynthetic energy with the soil community, with the microbes and the fungi. And then in turn, it receives more back, and it literally is priming this pump. What Reginaldo is getting into here is kind of the third level, which is, the walnut tree produces these secondary metabolites to control the environment because there's a scarcity. But if there's no scarcity, then it's unnecessary to produce those chemistry. But when you add that healthy plant, that healthy plant gets eaten by an animal or a person, and when that person gets its needs met, nutritionally, emotionally, socially, then it can leap into more of an open source type mode rather than patenting and this whole relationship to the economy of trying to control its values into that larger community is like the walnut tree, that when it gets its needs met properly, then we can all jump into pulling out our deepest values and sharing it with this larger system and getting to this level of large-scale abundance that we haven't seen yet, really, and I think is very possible. Just wanted to say that. I think you had your hand up first. Somebody's going to have to keep track here.
Radical shifting. So I'm going to throw this out there as maybe a crazy idea. But we can all agree it's really important to make some big shifts, right? Individually, globally. So if we use the idea of the microbiome is a popular topic right now, en masse, right? It's very common for doctors, conventional doctors, to be talking about that now. So, if we understand that the biome likely needs to be more complex for more complex thinking to occur, and after 15 years in 3 different restaurants, trying to shift people's food is more challenging than shifting a beverage choice, and beverages really spin through our culture very quickly. And if we think of veins and rivers and the internet, what I'm proposing, there's a new book out right now called Antisocial, and it drilled down into social media to talk about how literally 1,000 people from one lawyer in Southern California got information from the Drudge Report to Fox News to CNN, 1,000 people. So here's my proposition. If we have some really great herbal tonics that could impact the gut, that we popularize through the veins of the internet, and use that tool as an opportunity, as a pathway into people that maybe could shift the consciousness faster than if we did it one by one. Because that was amazing to me to learn that 1,000 people that this lawyer in Southern California activated through Twitter that ended up with messages on major networks. I mean, what if we thought about that? Veins, rivers, and the internet. And water.
The comment was like, can we create an herbal tonic that will help shift people's minds and consciousnesses and disseminate it through the internet, which is this sort of meta phenomenon that human beings have created in the last 50, 60 years. Working on it. What if they could all just have dandelion root tincture for starters?
Yeah, let's start with that.
Eventually, but they don't even need to start with it out of their own yards. They just start trying it, then it shifts their mind, then they make those changes, then we have our herbal victory gardens.
And no glyphosate.
Exactly.
I'll just add one quick thing to that last one, which is I was at the Organic Grower School in North Carolina last year, and after hours, there was kind of a bar situation, and people had made these kefir drinks. Wasn't a dairy kefir. It was just more of a beverage, soda-type beverage that had a lot of, good microbiology in it. But they also had about 20 tinctures on the table, and you'd basically get your drink, and they had information about each herbs and which one you might be needing at that moment, and put a few drops of this and a few drops of that. And it was like a whole different concept for me about what kind of, after-hours drinks and where that could go mentally. It was fascinating. I think it's exactly what you're talking about. Let's see, who was next? Faith in the back was, okay.
You talked about detoxing, and Guido mentioned this, that we look for that once a year, or twice a year shot that's going to detox us. One principle in permaculture is slow and simple, and subversiveness as opposed to action-oriented changes.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you're subversive, it's all of us touching our circle. And I find that seems to be much more effective, whether it's in your own body, or it's in the land, or it's in socialism or politicalism, that if I can influence one group of people that are surrounding me, that's where the changes seem to be made more faster, because it's slower. So I don't know if you could comment on that.